Hi guys, this is Connie, back for some more Connie Reads White Fragility because it's still important, even though, and I need to make more priority to get this done because I need to hear it. I think other people need to hear it. I couldn't even get through chapter 2. So we are on chapter 2. I think according to the playlist, we were on section C-ish part 2. I'm just going to go with the subtitle that is here, and it says Whiteness as a Position of Status. Let's see if we can get through this section first before we continue on with the rest of the chapter. Whiteness as a position of status. Being perceived as white carries more than a mere racial classification. It is a social and institutional status and identity imbued with legal, political, economic, and social rights and privileges that are denied to others. Reflecting on the social and economic advantages of being classified as white, critical race scholar Cheryl Harris coined the phrase whiteness as property. Tracing the evolving concept of whiteness across legal history, she explains. By according whiteness to actual legal status, an aspect of identity was converted into an external object of property, moving whiteness from privileged identity to a vested interest. The law's construction of whiteness defined and affirmed critical aspects of identity: who is white; of privilege, what benefits accrue to that status; and of property, what legal entitlements arise from that status. Whiteness at various times signifies and is deployed as identity, status, and property, sometimes singularly, sometimes in tandem. Harris's analysis is useful because it shows how identity and perceptions of identity can grant or deny resources. These resources include self-worth, visibility, positive expectations, psychological freedom from the tether of race, freedom of movement, the sense of belonging, and a sense of entitlement to all of the above. We might think of whiteness as all the aspects of being white, aspects that go beyond mere physical differences and are related to the meaning and resultant material advantage of being defined as white in society. What is granted and how it is granted based on that meaning. Instead of the typical focus on how racism hurts people of color, to examine whiteness is to focus on how racism elevates white people. Whiteness rests upon a foundational premise: the definition of whites as the norm or standard for human, and people of color as a deviation from that norm. Ouch. Whiteness is not acknowledged by white people, and the white reference point is assumed to be universal and is imposed on everyone. White people find it very difficult to think about whiteness as a specific state of being that could have an impact on one's life and perceptions. People of color, including W.E.B. Du Bois and James Baldwin, have been writing without whiteness for decades, if not centuries. These writers urged white people to turn their attention onto themselves, to explore what it means to be white in a society that is so divided by race. For example, in 1946, a French reporter asked expatriate writer Richard Wright his thoughts on the, quote, Negro problem, unquote, in the United States. Wright replied, "There isn't any Negro problem. There is only a white problem." As Wright pointed out, racism against people of color doesn't occur in a vacuum. Yet the idea that racism in the United States can operate outside white people is reinforced through celebrations such as Black History Month, in which we study the Civil War and Civil Rights eras as if they occurred separately from all U.S. history. In addition to the general way these color-based celebrations take whites out of the equation, there are specific ways that the achievements of people of color are separated from the overall social context and depoliticized, for instance, in stories we tell about Black cultural heroes. The story of Jackie Robinson is a classic example of how whiteness obscures racism by rendering whites, white privilege, and racist institutions invisible. Robinson is often celebrated as the first African American to break the color line and play in Major League Baseball. While Robinson was certainly an amazing baseball player, this storyline depicts him as racially special, a black man who broke the color line himself. The subtext is that Robinson finally had what it took to play with whites, as if no black athlete before him was strong enough to compete at that level. Imagine if instead the story went something like this: Jackie Robinson, the first black man whites allowed to play Major League Baseball. This version makes a critical distinction because no matter how fantastic a player Robinson was, he simply could not play in the major leagues if whites who controlled the institution did not allow it. Were he to walk onto the field before being granted permission by white owners and policymakers, the police would have removed him. Narratives of racial exceptionality obscure the reality of ongoing institutional white control while reinforcing the ideologies of individualism and meritocracy. They also do whites a disservice by obscuring the white allies who, behind the scenes, worked hard and long to open the field to African American players. These allies could serve as much needed role models for other whites, although we also need to acknowledge that in the case of the desegregation of baseball, there was an economic incentive for these allies. I am not against Black History Month, but it should be celebrated in a way that doesn't reinforce whiteness. For those who ask why there is no White History Month, the answer illustrates how whiteness works. White history is implied in the absence of its acknowledgement. White history is the norm for history. Thus, our need to qualify that we are speaking about Black history or women's history suggests that these contributions lie outside the norm. Ruth Frankenberg, a premier white scholar in the field of whiteness studies, describes whiteness as multidimensional. These dimensions include a location of structural advantage, a standpoint from which white people look at ourselves, at others, at a society, and a set of cultural practices that are not named or acknowledged. To say that whiteness is a location of structural advantage is to recognize that to be white is to be in a privileged position within society and its institutions, to be seen as an insider, and to be granted the benefits of belonging. This position automatically bestows unearned advantages. Whites control all major institutions of society and set the policies and practices that others must live by. Although rare individual people of color may be inside the circles of power, Colin Powell, Clarence Thomas, Marco Rubio, Barack Obama, they support the status quo and do not challenge racism in any way significant enough to be threatening. Their positions of power do not mean these public figures don't experience racism. Obama endured insults and resistance previously unheard of, but the status quo remains intact. To say that whiteness is a standpoint is to say that a significant aspect of white identity is to see oneself as an individual, outside or innocent of race, just human. This standpoint views white people and their interest as central to and representative of humanity. Whites also produce and reinforce the dominant narratives of society, which as individualism and meritocracy, and use these narratives to explain the positions of other racial groups. These narratives allow us to congratulate ourselves on our success within the institutions of society and blame others for their lack of success. To say that whiteness includes a set of cultural practices that are not recognized by white people is to understand racism as a network. I didn't get the page fast enough. Let's see if we can do this again. To say that whiteness includes a set of cultural practices that are not recognized by white people is to understand racism as a network of norms and actions that consistently create advantage for whites and disadvantage for people of color. These norms and actions include basic rights and benefits of the doubt purportedly granted to all, but which are actually only consistently afforded to white people. The dimensions of racism benefiting white people are usually invisible to whites. we are unaware of or do not acknowledge the meaning of race and its impact on our own lives. Thus, we do not recognize or admit to white privilege and the norms that produce and maintain it. It follows that to name whiteness much less suggests that it has meaning and grants unearned advantage will be deeply disconcerting and destabilizing, thus triggering the protective responses of white fragility. And that's just one section. We have another section in chapter 2 that I will do next time. Thank you so much. Be careful with that and enjoy, please and thank you. I'll see you next time.